But we may get some more stragglers in, and we have people on the internet. So, okay, so we're going to get started. I'm not sure how many have tuned in for this class before, but this is part of a series of a whole payroll class. And the first section was sort of just the basics of what laws apply, and then the second section was hours. What time do we actually have to pay for? And so when we get to this section, it's the wage basics. Okay, when we talk about wage and hour law, hours is what you have to pay for, and then wages is how much you pay, when you have to pay it, and so forth. And so these are the topics that we're going to hit on over the next hour. And these things align, of course, with the concepts we talked about last week when we talk about what exactly needs to be paid. But we're going to talk about the different wage rates. Okay, how much money do you need to pay for each hour worked or for each unit produced or however you've set up your compensation structure? What wage rate do you have to pay? What can you take out of those wages? Okay, there are certain deductions that you're allowed to make, but there are very specific limits on your ability to take away from those wages. When do you have to pay the wages? How do you have to pay them? And then I've sort of carved out departing employee issues as a separate topic because there are lots of specific rules for that final paycheck and what you have to do and what has to be included and so forth. So those are the big topics. If you have questions, again, let me know, and we will run through this. All right, I should have put this on 2 slides. Sorry for the very, very small font. Wage rates. The current state minimum wage is $8 an hour. Okay, that's going to go up next year. There's AB 10 was passed. It will go into effect. It'll go into effect January 1, but it actually won't call for a wage increase until July of next year. And it will increase to $9 an hour, and then it's going to increase again 18 months later in January of 2016 to $10 an hour. And so that will be the state minimum wage rate. You can pay a higher rate than that, if you want to. And I have a lot of employers that have specialized employees that they pay at $15, $20, $25 an hour. You may have an employment contract that says this is your wage rate, you're going to be paid X, Y, and Z, and you would be obligated to pay that wage rate that's in that employment contract. Okay, but this is just the baseline minimum. And federal minimum wage is far lower. Okay, it's typical of, as I talked about in that very first class, very typical for the federal laws to be less employee friendly than the state laws. The state laws usually call for higher and more stringent standards, and so this is an example of that. It's kind of interesting. You do have a posting requirement to post the minimum wage. You have to post both the federal minimum wage and the state minimum wage. At any rate, the current minimum wage is $8 an hour, so up until June 30th of 2014, you can pay everybody at $8 an hour if you're going to use minimum wage. Where the employee consents in writing, lodging and meals can also be counted towards that minimum wage obligation. So if you're providing housing, you have somebody that, whatever, they, are your caretaker or something, and they're getting meals, that can there are specific amounts that you can allocate against that minimum wage requirement. Can't you do that with tips and gratuities? Okay. If you're the waitress at Chili's, they don't get to come count through your tips and say, oh good, we only owe you $14 for the day. Yeah, no, that's separate money that goes just to the employee. Flag rate employees entitled to a minimum wage payment for each non-productive hour worked. This is a new sort of development in the law, and we had this. There was a case that dealt with piece rate employees, and then we just had a case that dealt with these flag rate employees. And typically when I say flag rate, they're mechanics. They're the guys that you go get a brake job fixed, whatever. And their compensation structure is set up oftentimes where, okay, we'll give you $100 for each brake job you do. Okay, if it takes you 2 hours, you're getting $50 an hour. If it takes you 4 hours, you're getting $25 an hour. We don't care how long it takes you. We're going to pay you per brake job. Okay, and that has been an accepted form of compensation in that industry. The problem is that you had mechanics that filed a lawsuit and said, well, that's fine and great when I'm at work and they give me cars to repair, but for every hour that I'm sitting there and I'm not given a brake job to do, I'm not getting any compensation and I don't have any ability to make any money. And so big fight, and the employer said, well, you're not getting paid for that specific hour maybe, but over the course of the day, you're doing 4 brake jobs, you're getting $400. That's far more than minimum wage. We don't have to pay anything extra. And that's typically, historically, how it had been done. And the court said, nope, you need to pay them for each non-productive hour because that hour, they are entitled to compensation. They're subject to the control of the employer. They're, at the employer's disposal. So this is a sort of twist. If you've got people who are being paid on a piece rate or being paid on a flag rate, then that's something we need to now pay attention to. Sub-minimum wage for learners. I love the term learners. Seems like I encounter a lot of learners during the course of the day. But people who, for the first 160 hours of their employment in a job that they have no experience in that field, no related skill set, you can pay them a percentage of that minimum wage. It's like, 80%, I think, or 85% of that minimum wage rate. And that's only for those first 160 hours. It's really can be a difficult thing to track from a practical standpoint in terms of, okay, how, at what point, you worked a 40-hour week, but maybe only 30 of your 40-hour week was working on this new task. And so I think it's far easier to just pay them their regular rate. If you have a lot of people, though, that would fall into that category, it can be a kind of significant savings, especially as we see that minimum wage rate go up. 85% of $8 maybe isn't as crucial as, of $10. And of course, the way California's going, it'll probably just keep going up and up and up. Prevailing wage. If you're working on a public work projects or a public works project, you may be covered by those prevailing wage rules. And the prevailing wage rules basically say if you're getting money from the federal government, you're working on a federal project or a public project, you need to pay this rate for the carpenter, and you need to pay this rate for the mechanic, and this rate for the whoever. Okay, it's all set out, it's very specific. Those wage rates are going to be far, far higher than the minimum wage rates. Okay, you don't want to run afoul of the prevailing wage stuff. Penalties are very significant, and it's very easy for them to track and identify. And this is one of those things, again, where they really hone in on that. Because if you're paying one mechanic wrong, you're paying them all wrong on that public works project. Okay, and that money will go straight to the government. Of course, they like to come after money that goes straight to them, so it tends to get a lot of attention. Had a funny situation come up for a client. They were doing a building, okay, a big discussion as to whether or not they were getting some funding from the state. Is this public works? Is this not? And they finally went, they were halfway through the project, okay, and they ended up deciding that yes, this was in fact a public works project. They now owed all this additional money and wages, and the building, the new tenant that was actually moving into the building was actually the labor commissioner. So what do we do to fix that? Of all tenants you don't want to have as you mess up the payment in constructing the building. Anyway, so we fixed it. It was fine. Okay, living wage. There are certain counties and cities that have passed by local ordinance a higher wage requirement. Okay, San Francisco is one of them. I think it's $13 an hour. If you're working in the city of San Francisco, you're entitled to a minimum wage of $13 an hour. Okay, so that's something that you may want to look up. If Bakersfield does not have one, Kern County doesn't have one. If you're going out of the local valley, you may want to look into that. There are a lot in Los Angeles and up in the Bay Area. And the idea is that the cost of living is so much higher here, nobody could live on $8 an hour in San Francisco, or $10 an hour, or probably actually $15 an hour. Okay, other wage rates that we want to think about, split shift pay. So you've got an employee who leaves work and comes back, and that break in the workday is more than an hour, like an hour-long meal period, okay, then you are going to owe them what's called split shift pay. It's an additional hour of pay at no less than minimum wage for the fact that they had to leave and come back. If somebody, I just had this question come up, you've got an employee who goes out and they take a 2-hour lunch every day, and then they come back and say, well, hey, I had to report, twice in one day, and it's split by more than an hour. If that's done by the employee's choice, I don't think you're going to be hit with a split shift problem. You can offset that additional hour of pay at minimum wage rate. So right now you owe them an additional $8. You can offset that additional $8 if they've earned more than that amount over the course of the day. Okay, so if you've got somebody who's being paid $15 an hour, they've already earned more than $8 over the course of that 8-hour day. Okay, it's hard for me to explain math sometimes, and people start looking, they're like, huh, what, offset, what? At any rate, we really only see split shift issues if you've got somebody who's being paid right at minimum wage or, you know, very close above, $8.25, $8.50 an hour. That's where you may have that split shift issue come up. If they're making upwards of $9, $10 an hour, they're working, you know, a full day, an 8-hour day, you're not going to have a split shift problem, even if they do leave and come back, because they will have made enough money. Reporting time pay. I talked about this last week when we talked about, you know, what hours we actually have to pay for. Couple instances when reporting time pay is due. First of all, if the person shows up and you say, sorry, no work to do, you know, all of our clients left us today, so there's nothing to do here, go home. Okay, in that case, they're entitled to half of their scheduled shift for that day. Okay, so if they were scheduled for a full day, an 8-hour shift, they're going to get 4 hours of pay. Okay, if they were scheduled for a 6-hour shift, they get 3 hours of pay. If they were scheduled for a 4-hour shift, they get 2 hours of pay. If they were scheduled for a 2-hour shift, they still get 2 hours of pay on that day because there's a minimum of 2 hours. When they show up and are sent home, they will get no less than 2 hours up to a maximum of 4 hours. Okay. So if they're scheduled for a 10-hour day, they show up, oh shucks, there's no work here, they get 4 hours of pay, even though it says half of the shift. Okay, we cap it at 2 on the bottom end and 4 on the top end. The other time that they're going to be owed reporting time pay is if they show up and it's not their regular scheduled workday. You say you've got to come in on Sunday and do the safety training. This is the only time the safety guy can be here. Okay, and they show up at that thing. They get at least a 2-hour minimum for that day that they show up. The key word in there is unscheduled. Okay, if you have scheduled that in advance, and typically the Labor Commissioner will say a week's notice is reasonable notice. If you've scheduled that meeting in advance, then it's a scheduled day now. Even though they don't normally work on Sunday, you schedule it, this is now a work day, they show up for the meeting, you just pay them for that meeting time. Okay. The little sort of tricky piece is, if you schedule them on that day, we schedule a 2-hour meeting. Okay, you're coming in on Sunday, they come in, it's not their regular work day, but we've scheduled it, so we don't know the reporting time pay, we're just gonna pay them for the time that they're at the meeting. Okay, they come to the meeting, we have a speed talker, okay, and the meeting is over in 45 minutes. You don't get to just pay them for that 45 minutes. You have to pay them for the 2 hours because they've shown up and they've been provided with less than half of their scheduled day. Okay, so unless that meeting goes 1 hour and 1 minute, they've gotten less than half, they're going to be owed that 2-hour minimum. Okay, it's a little bit confusing, but if they show up and you send them home, okay, if they show up and work less than half, or if they or if you have them come in on a day that they're not normally going to work, that's the key. One thing I should say about this stuff, this is only for your non-exempt employees. Okay, your exempt employees that show up on Saturday and say, oh, the training was 48 minutes, you know, too bad. You know, they're SOL. You get to do whatever you want with those exempt people. Okay, we'll talk about when you can deduct stuff from them. But when we talk about reporting time pay, split shift pay, that minimum wage stuff, all of those considerations only apply to the non-exempt staff. All right, deductions. There are certain deductions that are permitted, okay? Typically, if it's, you know, not something that's like taxes or things like that, you need to have authorization from the employee. Okay, if you want to have a, you know, holiday fund where they take money out of your check so that you have a big check at the end of the year to put towards Christmas, that's great. They want to participate in the birthday club or whatever, and they're going to deduct money from your check, that's fine as long as the employee authorizes it. Okay, there are other deductions, whether it's, you know, the disability and all that kind of insurance and taxes and that kind of stuff that, you know, or garnishments, you know, child support orders. You know, the employee may say, well, guess what, I'm not going to sign off and authorize that. Those things, if it's required by law, you can still deduct that money even if the employee doesn't agree to it or doesn't want to give that money up. There are limits on how much of what percentage of that wage you can take in each check for child support and for those garnishments. Okay, but you'll get the order and it'll tell you how much you can take and so forth. And so that's fairly easy to. Employee debts. Okay, the employee comes to you and says, hey, I'm going to get paid on Friday. Can I get my paycheck early because I've got to, you know, go pay this bill, whatever. My bookie's after me. No, I don't know. Okay, so you give them the money okay, and then they quit the next day, okay. What do you do about recouping that money you've loaned them or advanced them? There's not a lot you can do from an employment standpoint. You cannot use those wages for what they call self-help. Okay, I can't, as the employer, put myself in a better position than any other creditor who's owed money by this person. Okay, so if he owes, you know, Macy's $500, okay, I don't get to just take the money out. You know, I'm just like Macy's. I have to take him to small claims, or, you know, go to collections, do something like that to get that money back. All right. A lot of times employers will, you know, like to just, I've got money that they owe the employee owes them money, so they're just going to balance it all out and give them the remainder. And you don't get to do that. Okay. In certain cases, okay, if the employee says, I'm going to borrow $500 and I'm going to pay it back over these 5 paychecks, you're going to take $100 out of each paycheck, they sign off, you sign off, you can take those periodic payments out as long as they've authorized that. Okay. If they quit halfway through the payback plan, or you fire them, okay, and they still owe $300, you don't get to take that $300 balance out. You can take the regular scheduled payment out of that final check or at the end of that payroll period, but you can't take the balance remaining. No balloon payments. Yeah.
They have it in writing stating, like the employer I used to work at, they had, you can purchase anything you want at the gift shops on credit. You pay $25 every paycheck for your balance.
Yeah.
Regardless if your balance is $50 or
Whatever it is, yeah.
But when you leave, whatever you owe, whatever the remainder is, we will take it out of your final check. So if they have that in writing signed by the employee.
The employee can sign all sorts of stuff. Sky is yellow, the carpet is orange, doesn't matter. And the labor commissioners, the way they've set it up, it's really sort of a ridiculous idea, but they say at that time when the person terminates, okay, they can give you a check, you give them a check, and then they give you a check right back for the amount, okay? And that's what you can have them agree to. You just can't withdraw that from that. You need to be able to show, oh, here's their final paycheck, and here's what these are all the accrued wages, this is everything they were owed, and I gave it to them, and there's their check. Generally, if you've got an agreement in writing, okay, that they say, yeah, I understand I need to pay the balance upon, you know, termination or separation, whatever, typically the employee is going to, you know, pay that back. You know, you give them their final check, and then you say, oh, by the way, you owe, you know, $800 from the gift shop, you know, and then they'll pay that amount. But you can't just suck it out of the wages. Yeah. There are a lot of, when I talk about the wage and hour stuff, typically these are the statutes that you can't contract around. You know, there are some things where you can have a collective bargaining agreement that's going to, you know, undermine all of this. There are some things where, well, unless the employer and employee agree otherwise, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But when we talk about the wage deductions, minimum wage, you know, reporting time pay obligations, all that kind of stuff, that's not stuff you can contract around. They can't waive that. Where I see a lot of issues with deductions are, okay, hey, we gave them a cell phone and they dropped it in their pool, and so now we're going to charge them for their new cell phone. You know, if it's a company phone, it gets broken based on regular negligence, you know, they dropped it, they whatever. You don't get to charge that cost back to the employee. It's part of the cost of doing business. Okay, that's a cost that needs to be borne by the employer. You don't get to deduct that out of it. If they take the phone and throw it against the wall, okay, and it's based on willful disregard, recklessness, that kind of stuff, then you may be able to charge that back to them. Okay, but if it's normal wear and tear, I lost it, I dropped it, you know, and generally the employee is not going to come in and say, oh, yeah, I hit it with a hammer 18 times. They're going to say, oh, my kid dropped it, or I lost, whatever. So you need to be mindful when you give that kind of equipment out to employees. And I have a lot of that. This question comes up: am I better off to give my employees a allowance towards the phone, or am I better off to give them a work phone? Okay, and there's pros and cons on both sides. If you give them an allowance, you know, great. It's, you know, their phone, they're in trouble. We're in charge of fixing it and repairing it and replacing it when they drop in the pool. Okay, but when you want to get to all the information that's on that phone, because you're doing a harassment investigation, you know, it's their phone. You might have a lot less access to the data that's on there than you do if it's your own phone. Okay, but if it's your own phone, then it's your phone, so you got to pay for it and you got to take care of it and that kind of stuff. Tools and uniforms, same thing. Okay, that maintenance, or the laundering, you know, all that kind of stuff. Those are costs that have to be borne by the employer. medical exam costs, you send somebody out for a drug test, all that kind of stuff, all that stuff needs to go to the employer. You don't get to deduct for any of that kind of stuff. I just had a question come up too. They said they were sending a person out for they were sending the person out for a test. They got to the doctor's office and the office was really busy and they said, okay, well, we're gonna, come back in a half hour or whatever. They come back in a half hour, oh, you're still really, anyway, then it just went on and on. So the guy so it was like 3 or 4 hours of back and forth. And so then the guy submits his time card and he wants payment, of course, for all that 3 and 4 hours, which that's time, of course, that they're doing something at the behest of the employer. You need to pay for that time. You also need to pay for the cost of that medical exam, okay? I also had a question come up where you have an employee who goes to the doctor and the employee says, well, no, but the doctor's report came back, that's not right. They're just trying to bilk the system because they want to, file this big workers' comp issue. And you have to go back for the second opinion, you got to pay for the second opinion, okay? Even if you have reason to doubt based on whether it's the employee or the doctor. Okay, so business losses, breakage, blah, blah, blah. Tips, you also don't get to deduct for tips. Had 2 clients that were like, oh no, we calculate up the tips. And then I'm like, okay, don't ever tell anyone else that you do that and don't do it anymore. Yeah. Okay, salaried employees. When I was talking back here, all these deductions, okay, this is for everybody. When we talk about salaried employees, there's sort of this misunderstanding a lot of times that if you're paid a salary, you're therefore exempt. Okay, and that's not necessarily the case. Up until last year, we had where you could have a non-exempt person that's paid a salary. You still can have a non-exempt person that's paid a salary. That salary is only going to cover their straight time hours. Okay, if they work over 8 in a day or over 40 in a week, they're entitled to additional compensation. Okay, that's why I always advise people, do not pay someone a salary unless they are truly exempt. Okay. If you have somebody that you think is exempt, so you paid them a salary because you think they're exempt, great, but shucks, they're not exempt, okay, when that misclassification, that's what those are called, misclassification cases come in. When that case comes in, they're going to go back, calculate out all the hours that that person worked that you thought were being compensated by that salary are now going to need to be paid at the, whatever the rate is, straight time, overtime, double time. Salaried people, so now you've got somebody who's paid a salary. If I tell you don't ever pay a non-exempt person a salary, great, you're paying your non-exempt people hourly or on a piece rate or commission base, however you're doing that. You've got your exempt person, okay, they're getting a salary. Can you deduct from that salary? And the idea of being paid a salary is that you get this set amount of compensation regardless of the quality or quantity or time that it takes you to do this work. That's what a salary means. You get this regular amount, okay, and I don't care if you work till midnight or you leave at 5, you're getting the same amount of pay, okay? So the idea that we can deduct from that sort of looks like, well, now they're being penalized, either based on the quality of work or the amount of time that they're there or that kind of stuff. And so there was a lot of resistance towards allowing for deductions. But we've had a whole bunch of cases, a whole bunch of opinion letters, the labor commissioners weighing in, the legislature's weighed in, and so there are certain instances. If you've got a salaried person, exempt employee that is out for an entire week, okay, you can deduct a week of pay. They need to not do any work during that entire work week. Okay, so you need to look when your work week cuts off, because if you've got a 980 schedule in place and your work week cuts off at Friday, okay, and they didn't work from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever of the following week, but they did work Friday afternoon, okay, then they have not had a work week of no work. So you would not be able to deduct in that instance. This generally comes up if you get somebody who gets put on a long time jury, grand jury or something. You've got your exempt employee and they go out for 6 weeks. All right, and you allow for jury duty leave because that's what you wanted to do. All right, now what do you do with that employee? They're costing you a bunch of money and they're not there working. Okay. Where you can get in trouble, okay, is that if that employee has their phone with them and their iPad and they're sitting in the jury box and they're texting and they're checking email and they're calling people after hours or whatever, they're doing work. Even if they're only doing 5 minutes of work a day, they're working during that work week. Okay, so if you have somebody that's going out like that and you want to be able to deduct that, tell them, okay, you go do the jury stuff, don't, check your email, don't do any of this stuff, and we'll deduct that pay. If there are full day absences, if you got an exempt person that's out, okay, Full days versus partial days. That's what we look at. On a partial absence, you know, I come in the morning. Actually, for me, I don't come in the morning. I come in the afternoon, then I leave for happy hour. No, but if I come for a partial day, all right, they don't get to deduct from my salary for that partial day. That's why I always like to try to show up for just a little bit now. They could deduct from the appropriate leave bank. Okay, if I come in and I leave at noon to take the rest of the day off, they can deduct that time from my personal leave or from my PTO or from my vacation. Okay, if I come in the morning and then I say, oh, I feel really sick, and I leave, they can deduct that from my sick pay. Okay, from that leave bank, but they cannot decrease my salary based on that partial absence. If I'm absent for a full day, okay, if it's for personal reasons, I'm going to Disneyland, okay, they can take a day of pay off of my salary, okay. If it's for sick leave, I call in, oh my gosh, I feel horrible, okay. You can only deduct if there is a bona fide sick leave plan in place. That means we provide sick leave, you can take it, blah, 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 and either I'm not eligible to take it because I haven't been there long enough or I haven't accrued enough time, or because I've had all my sick leave and I've used it all up. Okay, those are the only instances when the person's out for a sickness. Okay, a lot of misconceptions about those exempt deductions, especially when it comes to full day and partial day absences. It's one of probably the top 10 questions I get. Yeah.
So if an employer says, okay, everybody's gonna work till noon and we're gonna have the rest of the afternoon off, but every salary employee has to put in 4 hours of vacation.
Well, no, that
To cover the last 4
yeah.
hours. Or not get paid.
Your scenario changed a little bit. That's the employer saying,
Yeah.
we're closing at noon.
Okay.
When it's at the employer's behest, you don't get to charge that back to the employee. When the employee says, hey, I want to take the afternoon off because I'm going to El Torito, okay, then that's when you get to deduct from that leave bank. Depends on who's the one setting up that schedule. Yeah. But that's, so I mean, and if the employer says, okay, hey, we're going to close early on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. A lot of people are doing that. You don't get to use that and then charge everybody for their vacation. You can make it optional. We're going to let people go home at noon on Thanksgiving. If you want to stay and work, you can till 5. If you don't want to, you have the option of taking it and use your PTO, vacation, whatever you want to use. Okay. And that's typically what I advise people to do. If you tell them the office is closed, don't come here, you can't come here and work, then you don't get to charge them for that. Because then everyone would just schedule everybody for Saturday and Sunday, then they close the office, they'd be like, oh, I'm sorry, you have no more PTO because you used it up every Saturday and Sunday throughout the year. Yeah. Okay, when must wages be paid? You have to have regular pay dates, okay, regularly scheduled pay dates that you post. We're going to get paid every other Friday, or we're getting paid the 1st and the 15th. Okay, you have some freedom in how you set up that payroll schedule, what works best for you, whether it's, biweekly, semi-monthly, monthly, whatever. But there are some things that you need to be mindful of, okay? Your non-exempt people need to be paid no less than twice a month. All right, your exempt staff can be paid at least once a month. And they have these sort of very specific work between the 1st and the 15th has to be paid before the 26th and blah, blah, these sort of specific time frames. The idea is you need to give them that paycheck no less than 7 days after that payroll period closes. Okay, and that's what the law says, and so we close off the payroll period, I cut a check, and I make sure that it's available to the employee. Okay. Okay, if the payday falls on a holiday and your business is closed, you can wait and move the payday to the next day. If the holiday's on the weekend, if it's on Saturday, the holiday rolls to Friday. If it's on Sunday, the holiday rolls to Monday. Okay. And then we're going to talk about the final paychecks as a sort of separate issue, just because there are very specific timing requirements for those checks. Okay, how do you pay them? Not with rubber checks. You pay them in cash, okay, or some like a live check. It's got to have an established bank within that state, and the bank's name needs to be printed on that check. Okay, it can't be your little handwritten bank of whoever. All right. It needs to be made available to the employee during regular work hours at the regular pace of business. And this says on a regular scheduled work day, but that should be on the regularly scheduled payday. Okay. So I have that question comes up a lot for employees. If they've got people that work all over, Do I have to mail this check out to them? You know, no, you can just have the check available at work and they can come get it. Okay, and that's fine. You just make it available at their regular place of work. And then of course you can use direct deposit. The question I always get is employers want everybody to use direct deposit because it's a lot easier, a lot cheaper. We don't have to send all the stuff out. We're not holding all these live checks everywhere. You cannot force the employee to use direct deposit. You can make it available. You can encourage them and try to help them, okay, set it up. But I have a lot of clients where they have employees that are resistant to setting up a bank account or whatever, that are you know, nervous or whatever, and don't want to do that, and want the check or want the cash. Okay, and so, yeah.
What about, I know somebody who has, they do bank cards. They load up bank cards, but it's
Those payroll debit cards or whatever, yeah.
payroll debit cards, but it's not like, but it is a debit card, so every time, like, there's not a local bank, so every time they have to go pull money, it costs them money every time. How does that?
Yeah, well, you need to be careful with those debit cards, and this was something, there was a lot of discussion, could you use them, could you not, and the labor commissioner said no, and then they said yes, and then the courts weighed in. The rule now is you can use payroll debit cards. You have to be very careful though, because if there's a fee that's associated with using that card, that's not something that can be charged back to the employee. Okay, so if, you know, and some employers want to do that, and that's easier. It's sort of like the other option of direct deposit for employees that don't want to open up a bank account. You need to be careful of that, okay? And this came up, I think, in the last class. They were talking about if you have a check that you give somebody, you know, and they take it to, you know, Tony's check cashing, where they charge them a huge fee to cash that check, that's not going to be the employer's fault. As long as that check could be cashed anywhere else, you know, if they elect to, you know, use it there and they get this fee charged, that's on the employee. If that debit card, however, every time you use it, you know, you see that little thing, oh, you're being charged a $1 fee, you're being charged a $1 fee. All of those fees, if there's nowhere that they can use that card without incurring that fee, that's something that the employer needs to cover. So sometimes the employer will put in additional money to cover those fees, okay? Sometimes they will identify places where you can go to use that card, you know, but they need to be places where you can go and swipe it and get the money. It can't be like, you know, go to Costco and you can use it to buy stuff, you know. It has to be someplace where you can go and get the actual cash.
They don't have to cover the charges, like if they're using it at Costco and Costco is charging them $1 fee to use the card, if they have a place to go to and they can pull the money out, right?
Yeah, they need, if they have, yes, if they, I mean, it's the same as I gave you you know, I gave you the cash. I just gave it to you instead of in the shape of a check or instead of in dollar bills, I give it to you in this card, and you can go to these 8 different places and get it. If you don't want to do that and you want to, you know, use it as a card and swipe, that's fine. They need to have the ability to go and convert that into cash. Okay. If there's no ability to convert it into cash, and that's when I've had this come up for clients, there's no place for them to go. They can only use it as a debit card. And every time they swipe it as a debit card, they're getting charged 50 cents, $1, whatever, you know, which that didn't work. So, okay, wage statements. This was a big one. We had a big law that said, look, the wage statements absolutely have to have all of this data. If any piece of this is missing, then the wage statement is not valid, and we're going to go ahead, even if the employee never looked at it, never complained about it, never raised any red flags about it, we're going to go ahead and presume that they were damaged and injured by that, and you're going to owe them money. Okay, they really sort of upped the ante on this, and the idea is this is all a big push to, we want to make it so transparent that the employee can open up that wage statement, know exactly what they earned, know exactly what wage rate they were paid, exactly what hours those were for, so that if there's a problem, they can contest it. The California legislature starts with the mindset of the employer is trying to pull some fast one over the employee, okay? And so the idea is we want to make this so obvious and so clear. There was a case 2 years ago that said if the employee has to do simple math, that's not going to make that wage statement invalid. And by simple math, they had a line that said overtime, a line that said, had another line for overtime, but they hadn't combined those two together. So in order for the person to understand exactly how much they'd made total in overtime, they had to add these two numbers together, okay? The guy worked for Bank of America, and he's, you know, I absolutely, of course, cannot add these numbers together. Anyway, and he filed a lawsuit, and he ended up losing. They said, no, the numbers are there. If you have to do simple math of adding two things together, that's not going to be considered an injury. Well, this is what people fight over. I mean, really, what you need to be careful of, I mean, and most, if you're using like a payroll program or system, they're going to have a lot of this covered. But it's definitely worth going back through, because I know 2 of the larger payroll providers that aren't doing it exactly right based on this new law, and I'm working with our employers to get it tweaked and turned around. So that's something to be mindful of. You can't just brush that off and say, oh, they know what they're doing and it's fine. You, employer, are the one who's going to be on the hook potentially. The one I want to point out, though, are the applicable hourly rates, hours worked at each rate. Sounds fine and simple. Great. The guy makes $10 an hour. We've got $10 an hour. He worked 40 hours. Great. Okay, that's all in there, and that's fine and good. Where it gets tricky is if you say, well, gee, we're going to pay a learner rate, so now we've got the learner rate in there. Or we're paying a different rate for travel time, because he normally makes $25 an hour, but we're only going to pay him $10 an hour while he's driving, because he's got to drive, to Visalia every day next week. Okay? Or if you've got somebody who, while you're working on this prevailing wage project, you're getting $45 an hour, because that's the prevailing wage rate. Oh, but when you work at our other private site, you make $25 an hour, because that's the standard rate. Okay, and they get these multiple rates. Then they work overtime. Okay, and we calculate overtime when we have multiple wage rates by using what's called the weighted average. We take all that money together, okay, and divide it by the total hours you worked. That becomes the regular rate, and that's the rate we use then to calculate overtime. 0.5 of that for each overtime hour, and then 1.0 of that rate for each double time hour. We're going to talk about overtime as a whole separate section, so that I'll go through those calculations. At any rate, that's done per work week. So if you're paying people biweekly or semi-monthly, and that payroll period reflects more than just a single work week, you'll now have a regular rate, a travel rate, the overtime rate based on the weighted average, maybe the prevailing wage rate. You're going to end up potentially with line after line after line after line after line. Okay? The idea of that wage statement is that it's supposed to be very obvious and very clear to the employee. I think at some point that employee can argue, I'm sorry, I can't figure out what in the hell this thing says, okay? Because there are 25 different rates, and I don't know how this weighted average is calculated. I don't know what any of this means, And if you're going to have that per work week, okay? Because that weighted average rate is going to change. I've put together and I've had this happen for a few different clients. I've put together sort of a little quick outline. It's sort of a cheat sheet for understanding your wage statement. Of how do we calculate this weighted average? What does it mean? Why does it change from week to week? What hours are we using that you can give to the employees? I think that's going to be, law doesn't require it. I just think it's a really good practice, because I think that's going to be the next claim coming up is, this was supposed to be self-explanatory to me, and I cannot decipher what this means. And I can tell you that having looked at some of those wage statements that I get, and the client says, well, this is every possible bit of information. I mean, you're scrolling down, it's like, how long does this wait? It goes on, page after page. No one wants to look at that stuff. And I mean, and for me, and I do this all the time, I'm going, huh? What? Wait, what is this 4 hours? Why does this go here? And it's very, very confusing. So something you want to think about. Take a look at those wage statements. Make sure all that stuff is on there. Make sure your payroll provider is covering all that stuff. Of course, WorkLogic does payroll, so come see us if they're not. Consider if you got all that information in there, and it's hard to cipher or to sift through and see what it actually means. Consider doing some sort of explanation. For temporary service providers, there's an additional requirement. Okay, so if you're a temp agency, you also have to put the rate of pay for each separate assignment. Okay, and the name and address of each entity and the hours they worked for that entity. Okay, so if you have an employee that's worked at 5 different places, 5 different days of the week, okay, paid different rates at each place, you're going to have one of those long, cumbersome wage statements. Okay, departing employees. This is the final page. You have a question? No, just flailing around. These are the final wages, okay, and this is why I wanted to carve this out as a separate piece, because there's just specific requirements. Okay, so the employee quits. Okay, all wages paid within 72 hours or, okay, on the day that they designate as their last day of work. We had a big discussion about this last time. If the person says, okay, I'm resigning, but I want to work through next Friday, and you think, gee, I don't want this, troublemaker here, stirring up trouble or stealing all of our office supplies and taking them home every night, and so I'm going to tell them to just go ahead and leave. You can tell them to go ahead and leave. If you don't pay them through that last day that they've designated, it's the same as you terminating them. Instead of them resigning, now you've terminated them, okay, so which may make them eligible for unemployment benefits, unless you can demonstrate misconduct or some other reason that justified you terminating them. Terminating somebody because they tell you they're resigning is not enough to disqualify them from unemployment, okay? So the better option, you still want to get that employee out, okay? Send them home, pay them through that 2 weeks, great, call it a day. Okay, that's the cheaper, I think, or safer option.
Can that time be greater than 2 weeks?
Yeah, it can be greater than 2 weeks. If the employee says, hey, I'm out of here at the end of the year, I just am had it, I'm going to quit at the end of the year, Typically, employees don't do that, okay, because the employer now has, well, let's build our file, let's go through and find all the reasons we can to terminate you in the meantime, And generally, the employee doesn't want to let the employer know that, hey, I'm out there looking for a new job and I hate it here and whatever, out of fear that they're going to get terminated. If you have a reason to terminate somebody, you can terminate them. And you certainly can terminate them even if you don't have a reason. The only exposure you have is potentially whether or not you're going to have to pay unemployment benefits. And unless you can show that there was misconduct or some sort of, something that rises to the level that's egregious enough that the EDD thinks it's misconduct, because their definition of misconduct is sort of different than the rest of the world, but if it's that up to that level, that's when you won't owe for unemployment. Then this is in addition to discrimination stuff and harassment. You don't get to just fire them because, they say, I'm quitting at the end of the year because I've been harassed here and I hate it so much that I can't do it next year. I'm starting over fresh. Okay, you don't get to just fire that guy. You have to go through the investigation and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so you're firing somebody, they show up drunk, okay, you're fired, that's it. We've got to have wages right there. Time and place of termination, okay? Doesn't matter if your bank is, in the next town and you can't get the check and all that kind of stuff. That's something you need to think of in advance. If you have somebody that shows up drunk and you want to fire them right then and you don't have the ability to get that paycheck, send them home, put them on unpaid leave, get all your paperwork together. I've got all my termination stuff, and then call them in, okay? If they're drunk, though, have somebody else drive them home or whatever, because then that's supposed to be another can of worms. You're like, yeah. There are special cases in that termination thing. If it's a seasonal employee, they're paid within 72 hours of termination, oil drilling within 24 hours of termination, and then temporary employees, they're paid at the time that temp assignment ends. You don't wait till the end of the payroll period. There was a pretty famous case of a girl, she was a hair model, and she went in for a single day for like 4 hours, had her hair done for some, whatever, I don't know what it was, commercial or something, and then didn't get her paycheck, until the temp agency cut the paychecks 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, and she got the waiting time penalties because they said, no, her employment terminated at the end of that assignment when she went home at noon on Tuesday or whatever. And so, she was owed like $500 for her hair stuff, and she ended up getting like, $8,000 for this one day of, anyway, it was kind of a funny one because you could calculate out. She made like, $120 a minute or something if you calculated it out. It was ridiculous. But yeah, if you've got a temp employee, you pay them at the time that that temp assignment ends. Okay. If they're suspended, okay, hey, we're putting you we're sending you home unpaid administrative leave because, Jill says you groped her. Okay, you send that person home. At the end of that investigation, okay, oh my gosh, he did, this is horrible. All right, we're firing him. You pay him at that point. Okay. And when you send somebody away on an administrative leave that you're deciding as a management decision, we're going to send you home, there are different considerations as to whether or not you want to pay that or not pay it. Okay. And so you can certainly send them out on paid administrative leave. If it's going to be short, it's going to be 1 day, 2 days, I think that's a safer option. It makes the employee less likely to get upset. If you got somebody going out for a longer period of time, you may want to consider whether or not you want to continue paying them. Because people who are at home getting paid to do nothing tend to start to like that, and then it's a lot harder to get them back in if it's a good worker. Penalty for failure to pay wages. Okay, remember wages includes that vacation. Okay, so when I say that final paycheck due at 72 hours after resignation or on the final day or due at the time and place of termination, that final paycheck needs to be time for all the hours they worked plus payment for any accrued unused vacation time, or payment for any accrued unused PTO time, if you just have a PTO policy. Don't have to pay out sick leave, don't have to pay out holiday pay, don't have to pay out if you have floating holidays, okay? If they're anchored to a specific date, you get your anniversary date off. You've been here for a year, you can take the day off. You get your birthday off. If they're anchored to a specific date, they're like a holiday and you don't have to pay them. Okay, but if it's a float, hey, you get 3 floating days, take them whenever you want during the course of the year, that's just like vacation, just like PTO, and you need to pay that out. Okay, so we want to pay all that stuff out. If you don't pay it, the penalty is up to 30 working days of pay. Okay, not 30 calendar days, but 30 working days. So it's basically about 6 weeks of pay that they can get for waiting time penalties. There's an exception if you have a good faith dispute as to whether or not the wages are actually owed. Okay, not necessarily if there's a dispute as to what amount is owed. If you know you owe them wages, but you're not sure how much it is, you don't get to say, well, we're not paying you anything until we figure out exactly what it is. Okay, but if there's a good faith dispute as to whether or not they actually worked at all or were there or were entitled to any payment, that's when you can withhold that. And then, of course, no balloon payments we talked about from that final check. Even if they've signed off, even if they've agreed to it, give them the wages and then have them write you a check or give you the money back for that stuff. Okay. Severance pay, I have a lot of employers that consider giving severance pay, and I generally will encourage it if you've got somebody that you've got some exposure to. They figured out that your alternative work week schedule isn't exactly right, okay, and now they're leaving, and their brother's a lawyer, whatever. If you got those kinds of employees, or they're leaving on bad terms, and you think they might be likely to file a lawsuit, that's when you want to maybe consider a severance package. Or maybe this is a very, very high-level person that's leaving, and they've been there for 50 years, and they're golden parachute or whatever they're called. Do not give a severance package to anyone without getting a release in return. And that release is basically, I'm going to pay you this money that I'm not obligated to pay you, and in exchange, we're making a deal, in exchange, you're going to sign off on this form that waives any possible claims you might have now or in the future that you think of later, that blah, 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 whether it's harassment or discrimination or wage claims or any of the stuff that people sue about, okay, way down the road. So that's the sort of tit for tat in that regard. You don't have to give severance, okay? And if you elect to give severance to certain employees, that's not going to obligate you to give severance to others. That could be a by-employee, case-by-case decision that you make. Okay, I have a client right now that's getting ready to dissolve everything, okay, the whole company, and then different companies are going to pick up some of these employees. And they're trying to figure out who's going to get severance and who's not, and who's going to get picked up. And we can go through and cherry pick, okay, this person's been here for 15 years, we want to give her a severance package. This person's been here for 6 months, but they were harassed from the first day they got here. Okay, so we may want to consider a severance package for them. And then you can tailor it to whatever that particular employee. Sometimes you may pay somebody a week of pay for every year they've been employed. Or sometimes you give them an extra 2 weeks of pay or an extra month of pay, or you give them, some formula used to calculate.
Can somebody file a discrimination case because somebody who's, say, I've worked there for 10 years, this guy's worked there for 10 years, he gets a package, I don't, really we did the same job, or is that?
In theory, yeah. I mean, if I'm at work at a company and it's me and 9 guys and we all get fired and the 9 guys get this giant fat severance package and they say, see ya lady, it starts to look fishy after a while. It's going to turn on, if it comes down to 1 or 2 employees and, typically if you can differentiate between those 2, that's when you're going to get out of trouble. But if it looks like, oh, that's odd, everybody who filed a workers' comp claim didn't get, this package or didn't get this, that's when it starts to sort of seem fishy. Generally, that release will have a confidentiality agreement. You're not allowed to discuss the terms of this. So on the practical side, that getting out, is maybe not so great. I mean, not so likely. So I think, but yeah, it's something you want to consider. And that's why I have up there, it may set a precedent for future terminations in that if you've got a whole group, and you look back over time and say, gee, we gave it to every, white male, and we've never given a severance package to any female or any whatever. That's where there may come a point that you get a claim. Even with that risk, I would advise doing the severance package. It is far cheaper to offer somebody $5,000, $10,000. Okay, they go away happy. You're going to spend $5,000 just to fight, that. And I've just spent last Friday fighting an unemployment claim. And that's the other thing you can use in those severance packages. If you don't want to cough up a bunch of cash, you can say, you know what, we won't oppose any application you have for unemployment. Okay, we'll waive that. In exchange, you sign this release, we'll give you an extra $100, $500, whatever. Some little nominal amount, you get them to sign the release, and then you're set. You've protected yourself, and they go away, happy. That unemployment cost is far cheaper than the amount it's going to cost you potentially to fight, a lawsuit. Anyway, we had offered her a great severance package, and she said no, and so we ended up fighting it. And from the employer's standpoint, we offered her a pretty nice offer. Okay, she says no. Now we're fighting it, going to hearings, doing all that kind of stuff. They're going to end up going out the same amount of money. It's just the money's going to come to the lawyer instead of going to the employee. It didn't work out so great for her. It was great for me. So, but that's the idea. From an employer standpoint, employers think, well, I don't want to pay all this money. You may end up paying that money anyway. You just get to choose who to pay it to, and certainly you get more bang for your buck if you're getting a release from that employee than if you're just giving it to me because I bill you hourly. So those are the things to think about. All right, well, that's it for the wage stuff. Are there other things, questions? Stuff is so interesting.
If you send an employee suspicion of drug they're using on
Oh, yeah.
premises, okay, so you send them for a drug test. During the time that you send them home, they just got there, maybe worked there for an hour already. Do you have to pay them for the time that they're off to go take that drug test?
You pay them for the time that they travel to the drug place, okay, the time that they're there, the time that they actually take the drug test, okay. You don't have to pay them if they were scheduled for 8 hours, they worked for 1 hour, and you're like, oh my God, your eyes are rolling back in your head, and you're all, you smell like pot or whatever. Okay, you don't have to pay them for that reporting time pay. They worked less than half of their shift or whatever. If they're being sent away because of something, either reasonable suspicion or whatever, something that they've done, you're not going to owe that reporting time pay. You owe them for the time when they were first there, for the time they spend doing the drug test, okay, and then they go home and then they're off the clock. Yeah.
So the employer cannot say, well, the test came out dirty, so I'm not going to pay for the rest of the day. They can't.
Well, they can send them home. If this is an hourly employee, I send you home without pay. I have reasonable suspicion they think you're using drugs. You're going to go do a drug test, and you cannot come back to work until I see that drug test is clean. Okay, they go home. I don't have to pay them for those hours when they're at home not working. That's fine. When that drug test comes back and they say, ha ha, I wasn't on drugs, you've already paid them for all that time, so you're fine. You had a reasonable basis to send them away. They can't come back and sue you for that. If it comes back dirty, that's when okay, this is our zero tolerance policy, and now you're gonna get terminated. I had a client call a while back. They had a policy that called for hair testing because they thought hair testing was could go back further in time, more accurate over time. And so the guy showed up totally shaved and arms and no eyebrows and yeah. And they said, well, now do we have reasonable suspicion just because he's shown up with no hair where he used to have a bunch of hair, Anyway, and so, and we went through, I had not drafted their policy, but they were very specific, and they didn't have, and there was no other option for their testing under their policy. So it was pretty interesting. So we, okay, well, here, how about let's change the drug testing policy. We'll republish it, and we'll send him in for a drug test, tomorrow when we have our new policy in place, But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that comes up. And I mean, there's a question as to whether or not that's reasonable suspicion because his eyes weren't, there was nothing, his movement wasn't impaired. There wasn't anything except that he had opted to shave everything, which of course, seems strange, but isn't necessarily related to the drug use. So anyway, yeah. People do lots of interesting stuff. Yeah. Yeah, when I come in bold, I guess you guys are all going to know why, huh? I'm sure. All right. Thank you.